Hello everyone, I am Hemil, and in between this talk, if you have any questions, you can just unmute yourself. I won't be able to look at the chat. I only have one monitor. So with that, let's get started. Do you see the screen?
Yes.
Yes, we
Yes.
can see.
Yes, so today we are going to talk about TDD, the bad parts. And disclaimer, all of this is as a backend developer, and I am not very experienced. I am not employed by anyone to do anything. So take everything with a grain of salt. How many of you know this person? No one? No one knows this person? You can unmute yourself. Like, okay, so he's Uncle Bob, or actually Robert Martin, also known as Uncle Bob, and he is one of the most vocal, I believe, among the TDD crowd. And my problem with TDD is a lot to do with Uncle Bob, because he believes that TDD gives us clean code, and I disagree. Unless your definition of clean code is that the code needs to be testable, then probably TDD gives you testable code. But it's not necessarily clean. TDD can give you feedback on certain areas, but it will not help you write clean code. It's a lot about experience and failing and doing the wrong things and learning from them more than TDD. Second thing, I disagree that TDD is equal to professionalism. So Uncle Bob has this thing that if you don't do TDD, then you are like, you are not a professional developer, not a single line of code without a failing test. And I believe that's basically BS, because there are a lot of scenarios in which you want to, just explore, play around with the design and, you know, just not write tests. In my domain, especially, it's a lot more important to get customer feedback first, because the cost of building the wrong thing is a lot more than the cost of testing it. So our first, in my field of app development, the most important thing is just build something first, fast, and then give it to the customer, get feedback, and then uh, once the customer has finalized that this is exactly what I want, then start writing the tests. And there's no way we can TDD this. Also, TDD is not equal to unit testing. So, for example, TDD is most often associated with it, but TDD just means writing tests before writing the actual application code. And I have not I read Ken Beck's book, and I believe there is no mention of the word unit. It just says write the failing test first. So TDD should not be tied to unit testing. In fact, I believe TDD integration tests is a great way to ensure software works in backend, in my experience, because this allows me to, for example, in backend integration tests, the idea is I hit this URL with this, for example, HTTP post, and I get this response back. And it works great because it allows me to ruthlessly refactor the internals of my software, and as long as my software works, as long as I get the right response, it does, I don't care how it's implemented inside. So what you say, when I TD, I do it with the database up and running. I test it against the real database, like not a production database, but a test database, which is exactly the replica of production database with much fewer entries or rows. And most people are like, but databases are slow. And my reaction to that is, when was the last time you checked? Because maybe they were slow in 1990s and 2000s, but this is 2020. And inserting 1,000 rows takes about 150 milliseconds on my machine, and that's with a cheap Kingston SSD. Selecting those 1,000 rows takes about 50 milliseconds. And if you say that I want unit tests to be fast and they cannot exceed 5,000 milliseconds per test, then I guess you can have 10 queries which per unit test. which I feel is more than sufficient for any definition of unit. And my second problem is mocking. So any example you find, most examples of TDD use mocking, which I believe is a flawed concept because it forces you to change your code to use inheritance. Because now you need to inject in your dependencies. You cannot just create them inside the object. You need to pass them in. And you need to be able to pass the derived classes in order to change the behavior. So now you need to use inheritance just to do TDD. Second, mocking tests the structure of your code. So for example, mocking tests if a function is being called with the right arguments and in the right order. It does not check if the software is working as a whole. So in my last talk, the tragedy of testing, I explained that, there was a dependency which was returning 5 and there was an object which was using that dependency and adding 2 to it. So that if we use mocking to test it, what we were actually testing is, does our object add 2 to whatever the dependency gives us, instead of does this function gives us 7. And that comes in the way of refactoring, because if you realize that, for example, you don't need that dependency, or maybe the dependency has a bug, all your tests pass but you still have a bug and you have no idea where it is. And here's what Dan North said about this. So he was talking about BDD, of course, and he said what we do with big, ugly software systems is, rather than simplifying them, because it's time and effort consuming and a hard problem, we come up with techniques to actively ignore parts of it. And he said TDD is a fantastic way of actively ignoring stuff that's going around you, because you are mocking all of these things and the interactions with them, instead of testing the software as a whole, because the software is not just the individual components. The interactions matter as much as the individual ones. But there are always exceptions. So for example, there is no way you can test payment gateways without mocking, because you really don't want to make actual payments while you're just testing your software, because you can test, for example, every minute, every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes. Also, another example, which is caching. And this example, Martin Fowler gives in his blog, when he talks about classicist versus mockist TDD. And he says that there is no good way of testing caching layer without actually, mocking, because you can do other things. For example, take the measure the time it takes to get your response, but those things are not very predictable. Mocking is a very good way to test caching layers. So if you have been around this space, uh, a lot of developers ask if TDD is actually a testing technique, and a lot of people say that it is actually a design technique. But so I fundamentally believe it's a bad one, because, for example, um, if it's a design technique, then it means that by definition, I can throw away the tests after I'm done with my design, because I'm not actually testing my code. I'm mocking away all the interactions. So I'm just testing if my component works in isolation, not if my software works as a whole. And the answer to this by most TDD evangelists is nope. And it's like weird, because mocking gets in the way of refactoring. And the TDD is a bad design technique, because I believe that a lot of design insight comes from actually looking at the actual usage of the component, as opposed to looking at the tests, because tests um, there are a lot of times when you cannot get feedback from the tests, but you can get feedback from the actual usage. And it has happened to me a lot of times that I actually built an entirely different thing than what I was supposed to build. And when I looked at the actual usage, I realized that what I'm doing is wrong. And I replaced the entire code with like 1/3 and 1/5 of the size to do the exact same functionality. And the rest of the design insight comes from actually thinking. So Hammock, uh, Rich Hickey, who is the creator of the programming language Clojure, which is very similar to Lisp if you have played around with it, practices what is called hammock driven development. So hammock, if you know, if you have gone to beaches, there are like two trees in which there is like a sling attached to it. That's called a hammock. So what he believes is during the day. So he is a believer in flow. So you get into these states where you can think and you are hyper productive. So he believes that during the day you should focus on the problem that you are trying to solve, and you should think about it. You should come up with 4 to 5 ways to solve this problem. Think about all the pros and cons, and then sleep on the problem. So because while sleeping, our unconscious mind is actually working on the problem, and after getting up, we can come up with a solution. Even if we don't do it in a day, it might take a month, it might take a year, but we eventually come up with a good solution. But I believe TDD is a good testing technique because while doing TDD, I'm hyper focused on this one thing that I'm trying to do. So, for example, my flow while doing TDD is which next input can I give to break this component? And after I've exhausted all those cases, I'm thinking of what is the next valid input that can give to test this component. So I believe it is a very good testing technique to test the component in isolation, but it's not a very good design technique. Also, I want to take this opportunity to say 100% test coverage doesn't mean anything. Certainly doesn't mean that your software works as per the spec. It just means that some test executed at least one line of code in your test suite. And there's this thing called Goodhart's law, which says that when a measure becomes a target, it's easy to be a good measure. So, for example, if you have 50%, 70%, 80%, or whatever minimum testing code coverage, then you're probably doing it wrong. 100% branch coverage is usually useful, but not always. It is the minimum that you should aim for if you have a good testing culture. And there's no bug-free software. So all software has bugs. That bugs might not have yet been detected, but it does not mean that there are no bugs. It just means that there are no known bugs. And with that, I'm done. So any questions?